Hello and welcome to the next edition of the Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Voice of the Customer podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on IT innovation and how it's making an impact on people's lives. Our next IT infrastructure thought leadership case study explores how the HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology engages in digital transformation for genomic research and healthcare paybacks. We'll now hear how HudsonAlpha leverages modern IT infrastructure and big data analytics to power a research project incubator and genomic medicine pioneer. Here to describe the new possibilities for exploiting cutting-edge IT infrastructure and big data analytics for healthcare innovation, please join me in welcoming our guest. We're here with Dr. Liz Worthy. She is Director of Software Development and Informatics at the HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology in Huntsville, Alabama. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks for inviting me.
We're glad you're here. It seems to me that genomics research and IT have a lot in common. There's not a lot of daylight between them these days. Two different types of technology, but highly interdependent. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. So it used to be the case that the IT infrastructure was fairly far away from the clinic or the research, but now they're so deeply intertwined that it necessitates many meetings a week between the leadership of both in order to make sure we get it right.
And you have background in both. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background.
So my background is primarily on the biology side, actually, although I am Director of Informatics, and I spent about 20 years working in the software development and informatics side. I'm not IT director, but I'm pretty IT savvy because I've had to develop that skill set over the years. My undergraduate was in immunology, and since then my focus has really been on genetics, informatics, and bioinformatics.
Maybe for our audience who wouldn't mind describing what genetic informatics or genomic informatics is. How does that shake out?
So since 2003, when we got the first version of a human genome, the human reference genome, there's been a large field who have been involved in the task of extracting knowledge that can be used for society and health from genomic data. So a genome is 3.2 billion nucleotides in length, and in there's a lot of really useful information. There's information about which diseases that individual may be more likely to get, which diseases they will get. It's also information about which drugs they should and shouldn't take, information about which types of procedures, surveillance procedures like colonoscopies they should have. And so the clinical aspects of genomics are really developing the analytical capabilities to extract that data real time so that we can use it to help an individual patient. And then on top of that, there's also a lot of research, which a lot of that is large-scale studies across hundreds of thousands of individuals to try and look for signals that are more difficult to extract from a single genome. So really genomics, clinical genomics is all of that together.
Right. And it seems that there's been a parallel trajectory between what the data technologies have been capable of that we can apply to this vast data trove and that we can apply back to a society that we can then measure. So tell me a little bit about where we are in that process. Are these the early days? Are we halfway through the journey? Where is the potential in terms of what we can do with this information and these technologies?
So the field has, like I said, it's existed genomics for maybe 20 years, but the vast majority of that was the first step. I would say over the last 6 years, we've maybe taken the second or third step in a journey that's thousands of steps long. We're right on the edge. So we didn't used to be able to do this because we didn't have any data. We didn't have the capability to sequence a genome cheaply enough to sequence lots. But we also didn't have the storage capabilities to store that data, even if we could produce it. And we certainly didn't have enough compute to do the analysis, infrastructure-wise. On top of that, we didn't actually have the analytical know-how or capabilities either. So all of that is really coalescing at the same time. So right as we're doing genomics and that technology on the sequencing side has come up, the computing technologies come up at the same time. It's pretty cool. They're feeding each other, actually. And actually, genomics is now driving IT to think about things in a very different way.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit. What are the hurdles at this point in time, technologically, for getting to where you want to be, and how do you customize that or need to customize that for your particular requirements?
So there are a number of hurdles. Certainly, there are more simpler hurdles that we have to get past, like storage. So storage tied with compression. How do you compress that data to where you can store millions of genomes and not exorbitant or at a price that's affordable? A bigger hurdle really is the ability to query information at lots of disparate sites. When we think about genomic medicine, one of the things that we really want to do is to share data between institutions who are geographically diverse. And the data that we want to share is millions of data points, each of which has hundreds or thousands of annotations or curations. Those are fairly complex queries, even when you're doing it in one site. But in order to really change the practice of medicine, we have to be able to do that regionally, nationally, and globally. So there's the analytic questions there are large. We also, we've got 3.2 billion data points for each individual. The data is quite broad, but it's also pretty deep. And one of the big problems is that we don't have all of the data that we need to do genomic medicine. A lot of it's going to be data mining. Generate the data, form a hypothesis, look and see at the data, see what you get, come back with a new hypothesis, and so on. And finally, one of the problems that we have is that a lot of the algorithms that we might use only exist in the brains of MDs or other clinical folks or researchers. So there's really a lot of human-computer interaction work to be done so that we can extract that knowledge. And then the other big problem, there's lots of problems. Another big problem is we really want to put this knowledge in the hands of the doctor whilst they've got 7 minutes to see the patient. So it's also delivery of answers at that point in time. And the ability to query the data and come back and have by the person who's actually doing the analysis, which ideally will be an MD down the road.
Well, interestingly, the emergence of cloud methods and technology of the past 5 or 10 years would address some of those issues about distributing the data effectively and also perhaps getting actionable intelligence to a physician in an actual critical care environment. So how important is cloud to this process, and what sort of infrastructure would be optimal for the types of tasks that you have in mind?
So it's interesting. If you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, on the healthcare side, the genomic medicine side, I would have said that cloud is not really part of the picture. And it wasn't not part of the picture for anything other than business reasons. So there was a lot of questions around privacy and sharing of healthcare information. So hospitals don't like to put that data out. And they're very reticent to move to the cloud. Over the last 2 years, that started to change. And many of them realized that it's kind of like enough of them had to decide to do it before everybody would view it as something that was permissible. Cloud is absolutely necessary in many ways, because what we do is we have large periods of lots of data that has to be compute and analytics has to be run on it, and then we've got periods where no information is coming off the sequencer. So it's that perfect crest and trough. Yeah, and so what you end up with if you don't have the ability to deal with that sort of fluctuation. So if you buy a certain amount of hardware and you only have it available in-house, you end up, your pipeline becomes impacted by the crests and then often sits idle for a long time. But it's also important to have stuff in-house, because sometimes you want to do things in a different way. Sometimes you want to do things in a more secure manner. And so I think it's kind of a poster child for many of the new technologies that are coming out that look at both of those, that allow you to run things in-house and then also allow you to run the same jobs on the same data on the cloud as well. So it's kind of key. Right.
Now, that brings me to the next question about this concept of genomics as a service or a platform to support genomics as a service. How do you envision that, and how might that come about?
So when we think about the infrastructure to support that, well, it has to be something flexible. It has to be provided by organizations who are able to move rapidly because the field is moving really quickly. It has to be infrastructure that supports this hypothesis-driven research. It has to be infrastructure that can deal with these huge data sets. Much of the data is ordered and organized and well structured. But because it's healthcare, a lot of the information that we use as part of the interpretation phase of genomic medicine is completely unstructured. There needs to be support for extraction of data from silos. My dream is that the people that provide these technologies will also help us do away with some of these boundaries, the policy boundaries to sharing data, because I think that's what we really need to do this for everybody.
Well, aren't we seeing some of that when it comes to other forms of data, perhaps in the financial sector? More and more we're seeing tokenization, authentication, encryption, where data can exist for a period of time with a certain policy attached to it, and then something will happen to the data as a result of that policy. Is that what you're referring to? Absolutely.
So it's really interesting to come to a meeting like this one because you get to see what everybody else is doing in different fields. Much of the things that people in my field have regarded as very difficult are actually not that hard at all. They happen all the time in other industries. A lot of this, the encryption, the encrypted data sharing, the ability to set those access controls in a particular way that only lasts for a certain amount of time for a particular set of users sounds complex, but it happens all the time in other fields. And so a big part of this is talking to people who have a lot of experience in a regulated environment that's just not this regulated environment, and learning the language that they use to talk to the people that set policy there and transferring that to our policymakers and ideally getting them together to talk to one another.
And you mentioned the interest, Liz, in getting your requirements to the technology vendors and cloud providers and network providers. Is that underway? Is that something that's yet to happen? Where is the synergy, if you will, between the genomic research community and the technology vendor and platform provider community?
So this is happening fast. So genomics, really there's been a shift in the volume of genomic data that we can produce with some new sequencing technology that's come out. And what that means is if you're a provider of hardware or services or solutions to deal with big data, you're now looking at genomics as the people who are probably going to overtake many of those other industries in terms of the volume and complexity of the data that we have. And the reason that that's really interesting is because then you get invited to come and talk at forums where there's lots of technology companies, and you make them ideally aware of the work that has to be done in the field of medicine and genomic research, and then you can start having those discussions. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of the things that those companies are already doing, the use cases are similar and maybe need some refinement, but a lot of that capability is already there.
Yeah. It's interesting that you've become sort of the New York of use cases. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. If we can solve this genomic data issue and use the cloud fruitfully to distribute and gather and then control and monitor the data as to where it should be under what circumstances, well, wow, we can do just about anything. So correct me if I'm wrong, though. We are using data in the genomic sense for groups. We're winnowing those groups down into particular diseases. How far-fetched is it to think about individuals having their own genomic database that would follow them like a sort of authenticated human design? Is that completely out of the bounds? How far would that possibly be?
So I've had my genome sequenced, and it's accessible. I could pick up and look at it on the tools that I've developed through my phone that's sitting here on the table. So in terms of the ability to do that, a lot of that technology is already here. The number of people that are being sequenced is increasing rapidly. We're already using genomics to solve, to make diagnosis in patients, to understand their drug interactions. So we're here. One of the things that we're talking about just now is at what point in a person's life should you sequence their genome? And myself and a number of other people in the field believe that that point in time is earlier rather than later, before they get sick, so that you have that information to use when you get those first symptoms. You're not waiting until they're really ill before you do that. And so I can't imagine a future where that's not what's going to happen. And I don't think that future is too far in the future. I think we're going to see it in our lifetime, and our children are definitely going to see it in theirs.
So the inhibitors, though, would be more of an ethical nature, not a technological nature.
And policy. So and society. The society impact of this is huge. One of the things is a lot of this data is, the data that we already have, clinical information, is really for that one person. But your genome is shared amongst your family, even distant relatives that you've never met. And so when we think about this, there are many, many ethical questions that we have to think about very hard. And there's lots of smart ethicists that are working on that. But I think we can't let that get in the way of progress. We have to do it. We just got to make sure we do it right.
All right, well, to come back down a little bit towards the technology side of things, seeing as so much progress has been made and that there is the tight relationship between information technology and some of the fantastic things that can happen with the proper knowledge around genomic information, can you describe a little bit about the infrastructure you have in place? What's working? What do you use for big data, for infrastructure, and perhaps for cloud or hybrid cloud as well?
So I'll say I'm not on the IT side, but I can tell you on the other side, and I can talk a little bit on the IT side as well. So in terms of the technologies that we use to store all of that variant information, we're currently using Hadoop and Mongo. Now we're also, we finished a proof of concept with HPE looking at their Vertica solution. We have a little bit of work to do to work out what the next steps might be for a proof of concept. Certainly we're very interested in looking at the solutions that they have and how they fit with our needs. The problem, the issue that's been addressed on that side is lots of variants, complex queries, need answers really fast. On the other side, one of the technological hurdles that we have to meet is the unstructured data. So we have EHRs, electronic health record information that's coming in. Really, we want to hook up to those EHRs, and we want to use systems to process that data to make it ordered and organized so that we can use it for the interpretation part. We developed in-house solutions that we're using right now that allow a human to come in and look at that data and select terms from it. So you'd select disease terms, and then we have in-house solutions to map them to the genomic side of the house. But we're looking at things like HP's IDLE as a proof of concept on that side. We're talking to some EHR companies about how to hook up the EHR to those solutions, to our software, to make it a seamless product end-to-end that would give us that. In terms of hardware, we do have HP hardware in-house. I think we've got 12 petabytes of storage. We also have DDN hardware, GPFS solution. So lots. We even have things down to GPUs for some of the analysis that we do. We've got a large stack of GPU because in some cases it's much faster for some of the types of problems that we have to solve. So we're pretty IT rich. Heavy investment on the IT side.
And cloud, any preference to the topology that works for you architecturally for cloud, or is that still something you're toying with?
We're currently looking at 3 different solutions that are all cloud solutions. So there are solutions related to, we not only do the research and do the clinical, but we also have a lab who produces lots of data for other customers. So a lab that produces genomic data as a service. And so they obviously have a challenge of getting that amount of data returned back to customers in a timely fashion. So there's solutions that we're looking at there. There's also, as we talked at the start, solutions to help us with that ebb and flow of the data coming off the sequencers and the compute. And we're looking at a number of different solutions that are cloud-based to solve some of those challenges.
Well, we've talked, before we close out, we've talked about healthcare and population impacts. But I should think there's also a commercial aspect to this, that kind of information would lend itself to entrepreneurial activities, products and services, a great demand in the marketplace for that. So is that something you're involved with as well? And wouldn't that help foot the bill for some of these many costly infrastructure investments?
So one of the ways that HudsonAlpha Institute was set up was just that model, so that you have a research not-for-profit side, but we also have a number of affiliate companies that are for-profit, where IP and ideas can go across to that side and be used to generate revenue that can fund the research and keep us moving and being on the cutting edge. So we do have a services lab that does genomic sequencing and analytics analysis. You can order that from them. We also service a lot of people who have government contracts for this type of work. And then we have an entity called Envision Genomics. For disclosure, I'm one of the founders of that entity, and it's really focused on empowering people to do genomic medicine and working with lots of different solution providers to get genomic medicine being done everywhere where it's applicable currently.
Well, a very fascinating discussion. Thank you for sharing that. And I look forward to tracking the close relationship between IT and genomics because, as you say, they're self-supporting, reinforcing, and both very powerful in their impacts in society. So thank you very much. You've been learning how the HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology engages in digital transformation for genomic research and for healthcare paybacks. We've heard how HudsonAlpha leverages modern IT infrastructure and big data analytics to power research projects as well as medicine pioneering findings. So join me in thanking our guest. We've been here with Dr. Liz Worthy. She's Director of Software Development and Informatics at the HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology in Huntsville, Alabama. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
And I'll also thank our audience as well for joining us for this Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Voice of the Customer podcast. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of HPE-sponsored discussions. Thanks again for listening, and do come back next time.